Okay, thank you. Welcome, everyone. So good to see everyone's faces and have everyone here today. It's always just such a pleasure to be able to meet on this platform and see different countries and different backgrounds, different time zones. So very grateful for everybody's time today and that you're joining us here. So if it's lunchtime or breakfast time or just about bedtime, we're grateful that you're here. And today, before we jump into our introductions to regenerative organizations, I wanted to just give you a little bit of background on who InRhythm is and what we do. And at InRhythm, we're all about creating conditions for health in the workplace. You can come join us from free mini workbooks to leadership programs and practices, as well as design labs, all online, or you can join us in consulting and in-person design labs. And all of this is really we offer to organizations and businesses, communities and individuals who are all committed to regenerating our broken systems that we're a part of. So this is a very exciting journey. If you're here at the introduction, that means that you're just starting off, or maybe you want a refresher and you do know about regeneration or want to make change in whatever role that you're playing currently. So we're just excited to be a resource. This is only the beginning. And today we have Trey Cates here, who's going to be leading us through the introduction to regenerative organizations. And just always a privilege just to work beside Trey and see him implemented within InRhythm and really focusing on investing into the individuals. So excited to welcome him today. Trey, over to you.
Thank you, Rachel, and welcome everyone. Super excited that you're here. Our time together will be having a conversation about how we've kind of moved into the direction in the current state of where we are today and begin to talk about pathways to move to a different one. And as Rachel has eloquently spoken, we are doing this with organizations, individuals, and in places all over the world. And we're excited to just be one of many who recognize a need for a shift. And we don't see ourselves as kind of the change makers and or shift influencers, but just one of many as we recognize the need to rethink, reimagine, and redesign our current systems. So with that, I will share my screen and we'll jump into this conversation. So hopefully everybody can see my screen. Does that work for everybody? Great. So as Rachel said, really this is going to be an overview, an introduction to the idea of what we think a regenerative organization is and why it's important. And so we're going to take some time to begin recognizing the current state and talk about our unhealthy relationship with our current working conditions and what a living systems approach looks like, and then just open it up for discussion so that you have an opportunity to discuss with others and with us what this may be. Here's a great quote from Annie Dillard. She said, "How we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives." And most people intuitively know this, but don't realize how significant the time is we spend at work or in organizations. It represents roughly 90,000 hours or 1/3 of our life. The other 1/3 is sleeping. So reality is half of our time awake we're spending in organizations or work. So the question becomes, is that current state of an organization that we're spending time in, are they regenerating or degenerating health and potential? And I'm just going to restate that question. The organizations you're currently a part of or ones that you're influencing, are we regenerating or degenerating health and potential? When we think about the current outcomes of the world and the systems that we're a part of, there's a huge trend of degeneration. We see this in terms of engagement rate, especially in the US, as we began to recognize that most people are disengaged or actively disengaged in the workplace. And that it's really showing up even when we think about the Gallup polls and the research they've done, that when they talk about people who are thriving in the workplace, less than 3 people out of 10 are thriving. Actually, they'd say 7 in 10 employees are struggling or suffering in their overall lives. So our current design's not really supporting a thriving workplace. And that kind of disengagement isn't just limited to this new generation. Some people say, it's all about the millennials. No. It's not about just the millennials. We have a substantial amount of the entire workforce not engaged, despite what generation they're coming from. And that is not just limited to people. We believe that our current designs have, because of what we've done, are influencing and degrading the current living species on our planet. So diversity as a percentage of health or as an indicator of health is continuing to decrease over time, especially over the last 50 years. And that equality, or how we're measuring wealth, is continuing to become more inequitable. You know, it's not a good design when an individual has as much wealth as an entire nation. How do we design for something different? And then we also began to continue to recognize the inequity across how we bring more capacity to people across cultures, across different backgrounds and or races. And the reality for all of us is, unfortunately, based on things like race and or the different parts of the world that you may come from, it influences your infant mortality or life expectancy, which is incredibly sad as a part of the things that we want to change or shift. So we see all this as a design issue, something that we can actually change. And when you get into the real data about it, the world that we've experienced today is a world we've designed to experience this way. And so we feel like there's a lot of agency and opportunity to change the design. But I think first we've got to understand what about the design needs to change. And that gets us into this idea that we talk about complicated versus complex. And this has been a conversation that's been had in system science for decades. But recently, General Stanley McChrystal came out with a book called Team of Teams, and he put this in his book, and we stole it from him to say this is a great way to sum up some of the challenges. And that is, most of our approaches, most of our design is truly built around this complicated challenge or problem, where there's a series of inputs with a series of steps and predictable outputs. But the majority of the challenges we see in the world that we are experiencing today is really complex issues or challenges, where there's dense interdependencies and there isn't a linear process or series of steps. It's nonlinear, and then it becomes quickly unpredictable. We recognize that everything that's complicated is really appropriate for things we make. But when we talk about complexity, it's about things we manage. And unfortunately, our designs have been mismatched in terms of our approach to be able to create outcomes without unintended consequences. And we, of course, advocate for that change. When we think about these two photos, is that complicated or complex, right? These are complicated challenges or things that we need to solve for. But when we think about nature or we think about people, these are nothing but complex issues. And with complexity requires a different approach. And that's really what our advocation is all about, is what can we do to encourage people to think differently about how we're going to apply real solutions and processes to complex issues. Now, before we jump into what we believe a solution is in that, I want us to root ourselves in actually the success of the complicated approach. It really came out of the Renaissance. It was deeply rooted in rational thinking and logic and cause and effect, and it created an incredible amount of progress. I mean, our whole philosophical foundation around Western civilization is built on it. And it was applied to everything from rockets to technology to our cell phones, the way we know today, our computers. Incredible amount of achievement. But that achievement was then applied to complex issues. And so here we have Frederick Winslow Taylor, which some of you may know, in 1909, started to apply this idea of the Renaissance, the insights of the Renaissance and the principles of the scientific revolution and industrialization to organizations. And he called it a true science. But it was the beginning of all of the industrialized process that we began to see in the United States. And that work began to create some enormous challenges. What we recognized that came out of all of it was that the most dominant metaphor used for an organization is a machine. Now, I want us to begin to recognize what is the unintended consequence of a machine being the metaphor. And I don't think we're typically cognizant or conscious of it, but it is incredibly rampant in our society. So much so that we see organizations as machines and departments as cogs and profits as fuel and people as parts, and that we continue to use this metaphor as we describe our schools, our economies, all as machines, and that the outputs would be smarter people, more productive people, right? And that our human body, even beginning to see itself as a machine, where our arms are as pulleys, our lungs are as pumps, and even a successful entrepreneur once said, think of yourself as a machine operating within a machine, and know that you have the ability to alter your machines to produce better outcomes. We are not machines, but we use language, we use metaphors, we use design that look more like machines than anything that is true about what it is we're trying to manage. So we use language like working like a well-oiled machine. I don't have bandwidth, I need to dial it in or move the needle. All these things, beginning to recognize that language goes a long ways to influence design and how we manage that design. And then even Dr. Seuss plays with all the language of what this means when we see ourselves in every aspect of our society as machines. And what does that say? The satire is deep, but it's very clear. It's not a good design. When we think about a Webster's dictionary definition of a machine, this is what it says. A machine is a structure that uses power to apply forces and control movement to perform an intended action. Pretty simple. But when we apply that to an organization, it actually feels pretty appropriate. That's how we've operated. That's how we have designed an organization as a structure that uses power to apply forces and control movement to perform an intended action. Unfortunately, that has created degradation. And all of the stats I provided at the beginning, from disengagement to the degradation of our unique environmental resources and people across economic equality and equity, we see as all a result of a poor design that is more looking like a machine than it is a real living system. So for us, when we apply that machine design, it's about engineering best practices. It's about saying this is the only way you do things, right? Because it's a machine. You just want to replicate its productivity and increase its efficiency. So that best practice is about enforcing prescriptive structures things that need to look the same, things that need to be scaled, all, in our opinion, create conditions of control. And you want that for complicated design, right? If we're going to send somebody to the moon and we're going to encourage our ability to replicate that rocket being launched to the moon on a regular basis, we want to engineer for best practices, enforce these ways of doing things, and control those particular outcomes. But when we apply that machine design, that is all about productivity and output and efficiency. When we apply it to a living system, we get degeneration, not regeneration. And even Albert Einstein said that when all of this starts to happen, when we recognize the complexity of our systems, the current scientific method fails in most cases. It doesn't work. And it's not that it's not valuable or meaningful in some instances, it's just not meaningful in all instances. So how then do we manage? How then do we design? How then do we begin to approach these problems differently? So when we think about that complicated, it is appropriate for a machine context, but it is not appropriate for a living systems context. And so we need something different. And so we really, as you guys are here, probably with knowing we are going to bring this approach, believe that life is a better metaphor and is a more appropriate one for what and how we should move forward as a society. And that's really being well informed. This is deeply scientific in recognizing the work of Maturana and Varela, School of Santiago School, where we are seeing, and they did studies and research and deep work around seeing systems as holistic, interconnected, and related. And that they began to bring out a bridge from the current mechanistic view, reductionist, industrialized, to one that would be really aligned with what would be some of our indigenous roots and cultures, that was deeply tied to wisdom and the rhythms of the life that is around us. And that systems view of life began to give us insights into that it's not about a reductionist linear process. So they did this research and they mapped all of the chemical, material, and energetic pathways of life, the simplest form of life, bacteria, and then began to recognize a couple of really interesting insights. In particular, that all they needed for life to happen was generated within a cell wall. And they actually called this defining aspect of life that is both self-maintaining and self-regenerating, coined this beautiful term called autopoiesis, which is self-poetry and self-making. Now imagine just for a moment the shift from this organization that is designed around forcing and controlling to one that's about self-poetry or self-making. It's got a boundary that it can create and create itself within. That is what we've pulled from the research. And so life is an organized system capable of maintaining itself within a boundary of its own making. Actually, life or living is regenerative, and regenerative is living. So for us, we see that for us to enhance and create conditions for life, it is in essence the only thing that can be regenerative, because it's the only thing that's alive, right? You can only regenerate something that has life versus a mechanistic system, which is really truly designed for a particular function, not anything that is emergent or deals with a list of variables. So within that process, we recognize there were some principles that showed up in that there isn't any real, it wasn't that life was located in any one place, and that everything was interdependent upon all of the relationships. And that, I love this, life is a holistic emergent property of that design. So you design with life in mind, you get more life, right? And each part or those wholes were self-regenerative themselves. And so when we think about people and then organizations or communities, all a part of a regenerative self-maintenance type design, autopoietic. So from that, we, meaning us and there are others in the space, begin to recognize the need to use a different set of principles. Not the set of principles that Winslow used, right? Which was deeply rooted in an industrialized, mechanistic, reductionist design, but one that was based in life. And so these principles give us a very different design and a context for how we would want to move forward. That we see things holistic, not siloed. That we see things interdependent and connected, not separate. That we recognize the uniqueness and how we put that uniqueness to work within a system, and that it needs to, because it is living, it naturally evolves versus being something that's static and will always be the same, and that it's nodal, meaning that there's the opportunity for it to be decentralized and distributed versus command and control, and that there's always a developmental component to all of this. It's never just you are all you need to be from the beginning and you're all you'll ever be, right? It is so much a maturation and a growth as a part of the system. So those principles begin to give us a whole different understanding, and even some of the most incredible designers of the 20th century, like Buckminster Fuller, said, work with life-centered principles and the universe pitches in to help, right? So this is not based in just this idea of doing something because we want to be different. It really is truly rooted in what gives us all life and how do we design around that. So for us, we recognized, just like when we talked about complicated and complex, that we need a new kind of framework to manage complexity, a new approach. And so InRhythm's developed as a part of working with lots of people over the years, a framework that recognizes the need to have things contextually relevant, that we put structures in place to ensure the uniqueness of a context, and that the work we do in the world is really as a means to create abundance, and that it's a lot about emergence. But we've added a couple of things that are really incredible. And one thing is this: when you think about living systems are no longer should we be measuring based on productivity and output. Living systems at its core are measured by health. Now, that is a very different approach. So when we think about moving forward, we talk about what does it look like to create healthy conditions in an organization or in any system, because it's living, versus asking ourselves, how can we create the most possible maximizing output and or efficiency? One creates conditions for life. The other one creates conditions to degenerate the life that exists. And so we recognize that if we can create conditions through structures to create health, we believe it creates better conditions for even more emergent and thriving, abundant outcomes than we currently are receiving. For us, living systems are informed by these principles. And these principles facilitate conditions that allow us to use frameworks that are flexible so that we can regenerate the health of the system. So it really is a very different approach. And that approach allows us to recognize that an organization is not based and designed based on a machine. It's designed based on a living system capable of maintaining itself within those boundaries. And where we do that, abundance and resilience are recurring outcomes of the health of the system. Now, when you think about that, a machine, it's engineering those best practices like we talked about, and that it enforces these prescriptive structures. And when you apply that to a living system or a complex issue, it degenerates the life of the system. But the living systems approach, informed by those principles, using these flexible frameworks, has the opportunity to regenerate the life in the system, because we are designing around the life. We are trying to enhance the life. One, it's all about needing more inputs and more energy, right? The other is it doesn't need more energy. It actually needs less energy because it's self-maintaining and self-regenerating. And what we all want to participate in is shifting everything from orange into everything that's green. right? How do we shift our perspectives? We talk about mindsets, behaviors, and practices from this degenerative and industrialized process to one that is regenerative and designed with life in mind. So now let's do the comparison. Which one do you want to be a part of? An organization that is a living system where abundance and resilience are recurring outcomes of its health, or one that is structured to use power to apply force and control movement to perform an intended action? I don't think there's anybody here or anybody in the world that wants to choose the one on the right-hand side of the screen. But most of our organizations, our cultures and societies have taken too much of their design from that kind of context. For us, what happens when we apply principles to complicated systems? I'm sure, I mean, think about it. You're gonna build a rocket, you're gonna do those things, and you're just gonna use one principle as a means to do that. It's probably going to create an enormous amount of frustration, right? And the same thing happens when you try to apply a set of instructions or best practices to complex systems. We get a lot of unintended consequences and frustration, which as a society, as cultures in places all over the world, we are all experiencing. It's all these unintended consequences. So when we think about the shifts and the work that we're all collectively wanting to encourage to be done, creating a movement of practitioners who say we need to move from this industrialized, reductionist, mechanistic system to one that's full of life, that embraces life and is regenerative as an approach and process. It's a move from best practices to principles. It's a move from prescriptions to responsive frameworks. It's a move from this dominance, control to interdependence, from prediction to pattern, and from extraction to equity. And our intention is to just support that, and that it can open up creativity, can open up all kinds of ingenuity. It doesn't need to look the same from place to place, which is a machine design. And so that then decentralizes things and provides the opportunity for real empowerment. So I'm going to close with this and we'll open it up for conversations. Danella Meadows, a just lifelong, she's no longer with us, system scientist. And she said this, which I think was quite profound decades ago. She said, the world is a complex, interconnected, finite, ecological, social, psychological, economic system. We treat it as if it were not, as if it were divisible, separable, simple, and infinite. And she said, our persistent, intractable global problems arise directly from this mismatch. We've got a design problem. This is not a people problem. This is not a generational problem. This is the reality of our systems and our solutions being in a complete mismatch for what we're trying to create, which is more life, not less. And so for us, we want to ask this question. In light of this information, in light of what we're talking about, what has shifted for you? What about what's been shared is a shift for you in this? And for some of you, it may have been new, and for some of you, it may have been old hat, and you are just continuing to reground in this approach. But we just want to really open that up as a process to ask, what about this has shifted for you today? So you can drop comments in the chat, or you can unmute and share your thoughts.
Can I speak?
Please.
Yeah. We're experiencing this stuff right now. I came from, I'm 77 years old, spent all of my life in farming, and I ran a really successful farming business in East and Central England, and that business was extremely successful. economically. But if I look back at it now, and having got into what I would like to call myself a whole systems thinker, I now realize that economically it was successful. Socially and environmentally, it was a disaster. I didn't see that at the time. And I think, if I think back now, I was environmentally trashing my base asset, and we were working more and more efficiently with less and less people. And the total effect of that was that we no longer contributed to the community that we lived in. And now I see life as having multiple bottom lines. And those can range from social to environmental to economic. I don't know how many bottom lines I could dream up. I think 8, 10 maybe. But we're certainly here working at trying to create a business which allows people to make a decent living whilst supporting themselves and the environment in which they live in perpetuity. So I love everything you said, Trey. I totally agree with all of it. And we are experiencing the sort of growth. Well, I think because we live in a place where there are so many people who are not thinking in the way that we're thinking. I think people consider we're a basket case, perhaps. But we're starting to experience life, I think, as it should be. And that's really, really gratifying. So thank you for the input this evening.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you for just your example and your authenticity and vulnerability on your own experience. And having a deep agricultural background myself, I have seen it all over the world. So thank you for sharing that.
Just quickly, the journey started when we almost accidentally went to the Savory Institute conference in San Francisco in 2015, and that was life-changing, and we're still going through that change.
Love to hear that. I was speaking at that conference, so I'm glad to know that you were there. So
I did actually speak to you a number of times. You wouldn't remember me because there were lots and lots of people there. But yeah, really grateful for that.
Thank you, Roger. Others, what shifted for you today, or any thoughts or feedback? We did have a comment from Brian. Yes. Brian said, I love the shift in metaphors and how it maps into the Cinefin framework. Other thoughts or comments, questions you may have?
Can I say one more thing then? I've got a question.
Sure, Roger.
Yeah, we're working with a farming system here in Scotland, and we have a community that's been really fractured by the COVID pandemic, pardon me, and I would love to introduce holistic thinking and decision making into our community organizations, and I'm at a loss really to start to know how. I mean, we're a community, we live on an island on the west coast of Scotland. We've got a community of about 162, so we're fairly small, but actually wanting to know how to transfer the holistic management and sort of whole systems thinking from a farming environment and a business context to getting a whole community to start to think holistically in the way that you're describing. I mean, because if you start to look at context and that sort of stuff, and you start to look at who are the decision makers, well, like the whole island, I suppose, is involved in decision making if you get into the sort of holistic sort of framework stuff. So how do you transfer from the sort of business model that we have, which is easy to understand, to looking at a rather more complex sort of social deal with 162 people and building a picture of how the future is going to look in the next 150, 200 years' time.
Mm. It's a wonderful question, Roger. And we're doing that in partnership with lots of different people. In particular, Rachel's here. We've got as a part of the InRhythm team, but also a part of an organization in South Africa where we're doing this in several villages in the Eastern Cape, where we're supporting the shift of those villages that are a part of a large kingdom of about 100,000 people. And each village has anywhere between 300 to 600 households. And we're seeing this village by village creating a shift where we're applying this process and beginning to see lots of real incredible things change in those villages. And so it can be, I think this is very fractal. It has the ability to be applied at an individual level all the way up to a community level. But there's got to be agency and willingness and empowerment for that to show up there. Otherwise, it's just from the outside being pushed to someone in a different context. So we really encourage, a very different approach in terms of how that rolls itself out and how that is embodied and nurtured and stewarded as a part of a community.
Does it mean to say that somebody like myself has to take a leadership role, or is it that we need sort of what I would describe the out-of-town expert with a briefcase who, like you, Trey, who comes in and speaks to a gathering in a community hall about the possibility of creating a different future? Because I don't know that my agency would necessarily be taken terribly seriously, because the stuff that we're doing on this farm is very different from the stuff that everybody else is doing. And as I said, they think we're nuts to be behaving the way that we're behaving. So if I went and said, I've got a really good idea, come and listen to what I've got to say in the hall next Thursday, I don't think I get a lot of people there.
Well, I think we can obviously take this offline, Roger, and have some more detailed conversation about it. But I think it's a both and. I think there is the ability to build internal capacity to be able to make those decisions unique and meaningful to the context of the communities that they're a part of, and have the ability to be in relationship with someone like us at InRhythm or other organizations that are supporting that capacity building as a part of the process. So. Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts before we call it quits for the day?
My name is Frank Lenn. I don't remember how I'm listed exactly, but I just recently moved to Durango, Colorado, and I had a regenerative art contest design, and I wanted to approach you with it. There's a local building called the Smiley Building, and I came up with this idea, Windows to the Future, and it turned it into like a regenerative design art contest. Basically, give the kids a bunch of basic models and principles and let their imagination run wild. But we can talk about that offline if that sounds like something you want to take on or help me promote or put together. So I'm a managing partner at playforce.com, and I developed a program called Chess Outside the Box. And the last session, is the outline is redefining wealth. One man's fortune is another man's daily bread is Mark Cuban's Twitch. Why whole systems, health, wealth, habitat, habit, living, learning, and design are the new $1 trillion marketplace, and what can we do today to make time and money our servants and not our masters? So I think about whole systems learning and all this stuff all the time, and I would love to see if there's a collaboration in front of us.
All right, thank you. Feel free to reach out and we'll have some conversations. Thank you. Anybody else? Any other questions or comments? Yes.
Medium.
Yes,
I can,
please.
Basically, I have two comments, one common question. First of all, congratulations for putting this approach into it. I work in the field. I also try to do my best helping organizations to work more from a regenerative point of view. It's just starting, since I came a lot from the sustainable background. That's the sustainability, that's my background. So congratulations for putting all this together. And I have a little bit of perspective, more the continent that I know best, which is Europe. And as you might know, here in Europe, there's these policies, a lot of regarding sustainability, the Green Deal, all of this. I would like to know from your approach and for what you feel right now and having that experience, how to break this concept that going beyond the sustainability point of view, that is something that already at least organizations or from a legal framework or from, they are just focused on accountability regarding climate change, sustainability, but they really don't get it this as an overall concept, and is very difficult or complex, as you might say, to cross that line and really have this, what we really mean about the regenerative organization and how to apply it in the real working life. So it's kind of a question, kind of a comment, but if someone wants to tell a little bit about the experience, just to cross that line between sustainability and regeneration is being hard, at least
Yes.
for what I know. So
No, you're spot on, Lily. I think the challenge for all of us is this is hard work. This is not easy. And it's not easy because even sustainability was built on this idea of some kind of linear process that we could get to versus something that's quite cyclical and is more about creating conditions. And so it is, sustainability was really designed around doing more good versus creating different conditions for something that creates real systemic transformation. And I would say that we've taken the approach of building lots of bridges to help those communities and organizations that want to shift from that, but recognize it's going to take time because they've got business models and or current structures that are deeply rooted in that linear reductionist design, which means some will take longer and some can shift sooner. Our kind of focus has been around those smaller organizations and that can move quicker, that are more embedded in their communities. And so we see that in that, a couple hundred employees or less, and systems that are having communities that have the ability to shift because of their size. And we know that all those different quote unquote nodes that change will create a real movement. And when we recognize the bigger that these systems get, the more challenging and complex they are to make the decisions that they need to make in light of what they've already committed to. And I think there are some exceptions and some examples of some of those larger systems that are moving in this direction, but it is incremental and it is slow. And it takes a lot of agency and energy to shift those systems. And so I applaud you and the work you're doing and all the things that are going on to be able to support that. By the way, we've just created a London presence to be able to support some of the work that's happening in Europe and Africa as a part of our commitment to growing a movement around this. So Phil, please connect with us.
Yeah,
And
I will connect with us and see potential partnerships, or because we have to, complex system require complex teams and
That's right.
partnerships. So
yeah, that's great.
thank you. Great job.
You're welcome. And just thank you to everyone. Sure appreciate you guys coming and giving us your time. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Rachel so she can close us out.
Thank you, Trey. Thank you everyone for your engagement and your questions, and Trey for the amazing presentation. I still remember the first time I went through the introduction. It was about 3 years ago, and I describe it as a little fire was lit inside of me. and 3 years later, it's still burning and it's just growing. So it really is an exciting time to have this. And like Trey said, please reach out. I know Jen's put her email address. I've also put my email address in the chat. We love one-on-ones just to connect and hear where you are in your journey and how we can support wherever you are in the world. We've, like Trey said, we've got presence in different locations to accommodate time zones and your needs. So yeah, please feel free to reach out, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
See
Have
you.
a great rest of
Thank
your
you.
day.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.